Hi class, welcome to our Behavior Change Replication Project. This is the PST group. I'm Allison Clevenger.
I'm Brittany DiStefano.
I'm Lucia Gama.
And I'm Shannon McDonald. The purpose of our study is to investigate whether awareness training is an effective treatment in reducing nervous habits such as filled pauses, tongue clicks, and inappropriate usage of like during public speaking. The dependent variable was filled pauses, tongue clicks, and inappropriate use of like. The independent variable was awareness training.
When we conducted our literature review, we reviewed two articles on the dependent variable. The first one was by Engelhardt, Corley, Nigg, and Ferreira. They examined the use of filled pauses, repetitions, and repairs and corrections. They also looked at language production as a three-stage model and analyzed the purpose of a monitor as an inhibitor of articulation of inappropriate words or phrases, such as verbal fillers. They concluded that verbal fillers most likely come when the speaker needs more time to produce speech. We looked at this study because of its analyzing the same dependent variable as ours, but also because of its looking into inhibition, because awareness training also is an inhibitory process. The other dependent variable article that we looked into was by Sanjaya and Nugrahani. They also looked at multiple types of speech disfluencies, but in all of the disfluencies they looked at, filled pauses were the most common. They did look at more types of filled pauses than our study did. Our study just looked at and. But at the end of the study, they asked participants what they thought the function of their behavior was. And they said either it was to create extra time to think or to sustain the audience's attention. They also revealed that they were often aware when they used fillers, which made our independent variable a little more promising.
One other article that we looked into with this project was by Wiskow and Klatt. This article discusses how awareness training can be an effective intervention for reducing other nervous habits such as tics. The study looked at a few different tics, such as eye tics, facial tics, and shoulder tics in a young boy with autism, Tourette's, and ADHD. And the study found that habit training was effective in reducing the nervous habits. The study used the same design as we did for our study, a multiple baseline design. And the procedural integrity for this study was 100%, and inter-observer agreement was 84%, suggesting accurate data.
Another literature review on awareness training was by Montes, Hynek, and Gierman. In this study, the primary dependent variables were filled pauses, tongue clicking, and inappropriate usage of the word like. They also tracked secondary dependent variables such as silent pauses, repetition of words, phrases, and humming, but they didn't intervene. During baseline, participants were given 2 speech topics to choose from and 5 minutes to prepare their speech. Video awareness training and in vivo awareness training were split into 2 separate sections, and they were given 5 minutes of prep time. In the video awareness, participants watched the first 3 minutes of one of their videos and practiced identifying their disfluencies. They were expected to raise their hand before the experimenter did and had to watch the video until there was an 85% accuracy of raising their hand independently. In the in vivo awareness training, it involved the experimenter discussing the participants' disfluencies and then giving them 5 minutes to prepare their speech. The same hand-raising criteria was set for this portion. It was a very effective intervention, and disfluencies reduced to below 75% of baseline levels for all 4 participants. These low levels continued throughout post-training with no booster sessions, and they concluded that competing responses emerged without specific training, So awareness training by itself is effective without any replacement behaviors being taught. They also thought that awareness training may have been functioning as a punisher since participants were required to watch the same videos over and over and over again, and they also had to raise their hands.
The next literature review of the independent variable that we chose was Mancuso and Mittenberg, 2016. Dependent variables were filled pauses, tongue clicks, and inappropriate usage of the word like. This study was very similar to the study that we replicated. There were 6 participants who wanted to improve their public speaking skills, incentive to earn $10 for every 2 weeks for attending sessions, awareness training, and competing response training. The competing response training made a significant change in the data that was compared to our replication study. The competing response showed that the awareness training alone is enough to train. All participants saw a decrease in target behaviors. Implementation fidelity was 100% and 87% of inter-observer agreement across all phases and participants.
The original study that we replicated by Spieler and Miltenberg, 2017, the dependent variables were filled pauses, tongue clicks, and the inappropriate use of like during public speaking. In this study, only 1 out of 4 participants engaged in tongue clicks. And all of the participants were college students who said that they wanted to improve their public speaking skills. All 4 participants saw a reduction in their nervous habits post-intervention. The mean IOA across participants in phases was 94%, and treatment fidelity was 100% across all phases and participants. We chose this study because we knew that there was going to be a verbal component to the project, and we thought that the study would be helpful in our presentation.
We used the behavior definitions from our original study. So the behavior definition that Spieler and Miltenberger used for filled pauses was that a filled pause was defined as any occurrence of a speech sound or word, such as or that had no semantic meaning in a sentence. Occurrences of filled pauses were scored upon the ending of each speech sound. All 4 replication participants used filled pauses in baseline.
According to Spieler and Miltenberg, likes were defined as any occurrence of the word like in speech that didn't follow correct grammatical, semantic, or syntactical form. This definition could include the speaker saying like before describing what someone said. For example, she was like, I need to leave. Or saying like before describing an approximation of a number, size, event, feeling, or cognition. I have like 20 homework assignments in this class left. This definition did not include the speaker saying like to express interest, such as I like ice cream, or similarity between 2 items, such as I am a lot like her mother. All of us used like inappropriately in our baseline videos.
The behavior definition for tongue clicks were defined as a speaker emitting a click sound with his or her tongue that could be heard from at least 3 meters away. Occurrences of tongue clicks were scored upon the discrete ending of each click sound. Only Jasmine engaged in tongue clicks. Now that the replicationist participants used tongue clicks in their baseline.
These were our phases, and the first one was baseline, then we had awareness training, and we had post-awareness training. So baseline and post-awareness training mirrored each other, with the only difference being the timing, of course. Baseline was before awareness training, and post-awareness training was after. Awareness training was only one session long for 3 of us, and one of us had a booster session. In the following slides, we will talk more about what each phase consisted of.
Participants and setting. 4 students for the Spiller and Miltenberg study. 4 students, 3 females and a male, attending the University of South Florida, participated in the original study. Karen, who was a first-year graduate student, Jasmine, an undergraduate student, Tyler, a fourth-year undergraduate student, and Michelle, a fourth-year undergraduate student. These participants received $1 for every session they attended. In our behavior change replication, all 4 of us were female. We were all graduate students enrolled in online advanced behavior analysis at Ball State University. Allison is from Orange County, California. Myself, Brittany, is from Sholo, Arizona. Lucia is from San Diego, California. And Shannon McDonald is from Canada.
The procedures for the Spieler and Miltenberger, the baseline and training sessions, post-intervention sessions, and generality probes were all held in a conference room at the university's campus. The PI, the primary investigator, collected data on occurrences of target behaviors via video recording. They used frequency within 15-second intervals to collect the data, which was then combined into habits per minute. Trained assistants were used to collect IOA data, and IOA was found to be 33 to 36% of sessions across participants. In our replication study, baseline, training, and post-intervention sessions were all held within the participants' homes. Speeches were video recorded and uploaded to YouTube. The participants collected PI data on their own behavior and on at least one other participant's target behaviors, and IOA data on at least one other participant's target behaviors. We used frequency within 15-second intervals to collect data, just like the original study, and then we combined those into habits per minute, just like the original.
The booster awareness training sessions were when a participant's nervous habit did not decrease by 80% in the first post-awareness training videos, or also if their nervous habits went back up when they were giving a booster session. The booster sessions were identical to awareness training sessions, and our group only had one participant that needed a booster session due to an increasing trend by her third video. In the booster session, she didn't have any nervous habits.
Here you can see a screenshot of the top part of our data tracking sheet. To match the original study, we created a data sheet that broke the 5 minutes of possible speech time into 15-second intervals. We used the sheet for baseline and post-awareness training, as well as primary and IOA data tracking. The habits were tracked by frequency, within each interval, to reach a total number of habits per interval for IOA purposes. The data ultimately were reported as total number of habits divided by the length of the speech to yield the rate of habits per minute. Brittany is going to tell you about the results from Spieler and Miltenberger.
Results in Spieler and Miltenberger 2017 Following treatment, each participant saw a reduction in their nervous habits while speaking publicly. Karen had the highest baseline data of 12.9 habits per minute. When comparing our data, you will see that our highest baseline data was 4.8 habits per minute. So our habits per minute was much lower than the average habits per minute that were recorded for baseline data in the original participants. Also, our post-treatment data, habits per minute, decreased to 0 habits per minute following post-treatment habits per minute.
So in my data results, you can see that I had relatively low rates of behavior to begin with, but I did fluctuate back and forth just a little bit. But from the table 2, you can tell that I did decrease my habits in post-intervention. So in my graph, you can see that my level drops to a lower level. Again, the scale on the ordinate is 0 to 5, so I go from no trend to a lower level no trend. Something that I found interesting in my post-awareness training speeches is that I was able to completely eliminate inappropriate uses of the word like, but there were instances of or that slipped through that I didn't even notice, that I was very surprised to hear when I was taking my data later. So I found that interesting, that the awareness training, for me at least, was more effective in catching the inappropriate likes than it was in catching the ums and uhs.
For my baseline data, my highest habits per minute was 4.8, and my habits per minute and my baseline data were saying as a target behavior. For my post-awareness training data, my habits per minute went down, but hitting my 3rd session, my habits started to go back up. But the interesting thing that I found was opposite of Allison. What Allison discussed was that my habits per my target behaviors were, instead of saying I started to say like, which is why my habits per minute started to increase. As you can see in my data, my nervous habits were pretty high for my baseline data, but then they dipped down and then they went right back up. My post-awareness training, my data seemed to go down for sessions 6 and 7, or 1 and 2, and then they increased during my 3rd session, which required me to have a booster session by Lucia, which then you can see that through the booster session, my habits decreased to 0.
These are my results. As you can see, they start off a little bit low for baseline, but they definitely start to increase. And then when you see the post-awareness training data, it just all goes down to 0. And here on the baseline, you can see the increasing trend. And in the post-awareness, again, zeros. I think that apart from everything, what made me have a lot more of these fillers in baseline was that it was difficult enough to come up with enough talking points for 5 minutes, because even though I read that we could have 3-minute long videos, I was really obsessed with making sure they were 5 minutes. So I didn't want to stop before then. And then in the post-awareness phase, I kind of accepted, okay, I can just do 3 minutes. So I felt that it was a lot easier to come up with talking points. And the awareness training really helped me think about the habits before they would occur. And I realized that I would stop myself by pausing and using other words apart from like. Even if I was using like correctly, I was just trying to avoid the word altogether because I desperately did not want a booster session. So that to me helped a lot, because I kept thinking, if I say any of these words, I'm going to have a booster session, and I do not want to do that. So that's probably why it ended up so nicely done.
Looking at my data, you can see that my baseline habits per minute are relatively low. And I think that's because I was subconsciously aware of what I was supposed to be tracking. So without even really knowing it, I was preventing myself from saying and like inappropriately. Oddly enough, post-intervention, I am also the opposite of Allison. I went from saying a whole lot to saying like a whole, which I rarely said like in my baseline. You can see that from my baseline, I do have a bit of an upward trend. And I also found filling the 5 minutes was quite difficult, even doing the 10-minute prep time. One thing I found with this project is while it hasn't completely stopped me from saying and like inappropriately, I'm very aware of it. For instance, every time I've said while giving this presentation, I've been aware of it, but I haven't caught it beforehand. So still working on that part.
IOA was calculated by dividing the smaller number of observed behaviors by the larger number of observed behaviors for each interval, which was 15 seconds, tracked to yield a decimal amount. So if two intervals were the same, they scored a 1. And then the decimal amounts were added together and divided by the total number of intervals, then multiplied by 100 to yield this inter-observer agreement. In the original study, the IOA data was collected in 33 to 36% of sessions across participants and phases, and they had an amazing IOA of 94%. In our replication, we conducted IOA in 60% of sessions across baseline and post-intervention, and we had a rate of 87.87%, which was not as good as the original study, but it was still a pretty high IOA.
Treatment fidelity was tracked with a checklist in both the original study and the replication. Treatment fidelity percentage was calculated by dividing the number of steps marked yes by the total number of steps. In the original study, the treatment fidelity data were collected in 33% of the sessions and had a rate of 100%. And the replication, treatment fidelity data were collected in 60% of the sessions across baseline and post-intervention at a rate of 40%. Most likely to forgetting, this was due to us forgetting to record our prep time, which had steps counted towards our fidelity checklist.
The data indicates in conclusion that awareness training isn't an is an effective intervention for reducing nervous habits. Each participant in the replication study saw a reduction in the occurrence of nervous habits post-intervention. The participants of this study also found themselves to be more aware of the occurrences of their own behavior and of other people's nervous habits as well, more so than they had been prior to the intervention.
Some limitations that we found in our study that we have mentioned in the presentation, but we'll mention again, is that knowledge of the intervention during our baseline videos may have been problematic. So after doing the project protocol before we began collecting baseline data, we were already very aware of the awareness training process. So even without having undergone formal awareness training as part of the project, we did know what it entailed and we knew what was going to happen. Another limitation was that we had already low baseline rates of behavior, especially compared to the rates of behavior of the original study. So it was more difficult to show a broad change in behavior when the jump was very minimal. It's also unclear if recording videos mirrors a true public speaking experience. We did discuss that we felt more comfortable delivering speeches to a camera than we potentially would have in front of a room full of people. So that may have affected how many nervous habits we exhibited, but it's because of the nature of an online class, it's impossible for us to really know how much of a role this element of the replication played. Another limitation of our study is that we did not follow multiple baseline design like the original study did due to the short time available. We wanted to make sure that everyone was able to finish within the timeline and that nobody's intervention and post-intervention data got pushed to the last minute. And it was more diplomatic to just forego doing appropriate multiple baseline than to risk someone feeling put out because they were the last person in the baseline and we just never got to them. On the next slide, you can see our references of the articles that we talked about, and our original article is in there somewhere, second from the bottom. Thank you for listening to our presentation. We look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.